Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Poetry at the Albany Library. And we thank, first of all, always friends of the Albany Library who really do make this series possible. So tonight we have an exploration of political poems, and Rebecca Black, Albany's Poet Laureate, is doing something new with this by offering various, as I say, perspectives. Other poets who are reading their work, but looking at their poetry of protest in relation to other political poems.
Pull the mic towards you. It's going to feedback.
Is that's the solution?
Point it down, yeah, not to the sky.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know that tip. Okay. All right. So, as I say, Rebecca Black, she's Albany's Poet Laureate and has been very, very busy in April doing wonderful things, and has hopped right into May with this project, which will also be online within a few weeks, so it can be shared widely, I hope, because it's going to be a wonderful night. So I want to introduce Rebecca Black here, and she'll introduce our other readers. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. So thanks to Catherine for running the series for 11 years. And thanks to the poets for coming from Davis and Alameda and Cal and San Francisco to be with us tonight. It's really great to have them here. So I'll be brief. I'll just introduce the poets so we can do that before they start reading. Let's see, John Shoptaw will be first. He was raised in the drained Mississippi River floodplain of the Missouri Boot Heel. And he has one book of poems, Times Beach, which was the surprise and wonderful winner of the Northern California Book Award in Poetry last year. So his poems have appeared widely. If you're interested in eco-poetry, you should talk to John, and you might refer to the January 2017 issue of Poetry, where he has a sort of treatise on eco-poetry. So that's our friend John. Next we have Brittany Perham, who is teaching at Stanford at the moment. She has one full-length poetry collection, The Curiosities. She has a new collaborative chapbook. Who did you collaborate with, Brittany?
It's Kim Adenizio, the other writer.
Kim Adenizio, the San Francisco poet. And then she has a full-length book coming out, Double Portrait, which I see a copy of there. It's very exciting. She was a Wallace Stegner fellow, and I believe is a Jones lecturer at the moment down at Stanford. Katie Peterson is here with us. She's a professor at Davis. She has 3 poetry collections, This One Tree, 2006, Permission, 2013, and The Accounts, 2013. Her edition of Brief Selected Poems of Robert Lowell just came out from FSG in March of this year. So that's pretty exciting. Next we have Amos White here from Alameda. He's a haiku poet, author, producer, and activist. I hear he's doing even more things than are listed on this little bio that maybe he can tell us about. He's founder and host of the Heart of the Muse Creative Salon, and the producer and host of Beyond Words Jazz and Poetry Show, and produces the Oakland Haiku and Poetry Festival. He serves on the board of several arts organizations. So please join me in a quick welcome for all of these amazing folks. Do you want to see?
You gonna speak from the podium? Let's maybe get that mic. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
I think that's.
You all can hear me okay? Well, I love an event where I can be here as a poetry reader as well as a poetry writer, because I don't know which. I wouldn't want to give up either activity. I love them both. So I brought along a poem by Jane Hirschfield. I'm sure many of you know her. You may not know this poem, which was just published recently. I'll say something about it in a minute. First, I just thought I would say just something very general about political poetry. I think for political poetry to be more than an oxymoron, for it to be more than impossible, there needs to be something about the poetry which is larger or somehow different than its occasion or its message. There's something that's somewhat at odds, or something strange about it which would separate it from other kinds of political discourse. Hirschfield's poem is an occasional poem, so it's in special need of transcending its occasion, which was the recent March for Science in D.C. and across the nation in various venues, including Berkeley, where I marched, holding up my sign, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty." Got a few smiles. It wasn't very hard-edged, but there it was. I think when you think about that march and what was behind it, supporting science and supporting not only the scientists but the scientific method, something that's beyond politics and is based in fact and open inquiry. You might very well expect a poem that's realist, that's fact filled, but that's not what Hirschfield gives us. So let me read this, and I'll say maybe a word about it, and then I'll turn to mine. It's called "On the Fifth Day." I'm sure you can hear the echo of Genesis there, and I looked up myself what happened in the fifth day, and that's when the creatures of the sea as well as the creatures of the air were created. Not the creeping things, that's the next day, but before them. On the fifth day, the scientists who studied the rivers were forbidden to speak or to study the rivers. The scientists who studied the air were told not to speak of the air, and the ones who worked for the farmers were silenced, and the ones who worked for the bees. Someone from deep in the Badlands began posting facts. The facts were told they could not speak and were taken away. The facts, surprised to be taken, were silent. Now it was only the rivers that spoke of the rivers, and only the wind that spoke of its bees. While the unpausing factual buds of the fruit trees continued to move toward their fruit, the silence spoke loudly of silence, and the rivers kept speaking of rivers, of boulders and air. In gravity, earless and tongueless, the untested rivers kept speaking. Bus drivers, shelf stockers, code writers, machinists, accountants, lab techs, cellists kept speaking. They spoke on the fifth day of silence. One thing I noticed when I was at the March for Science was a number of signs which contained the word silence. I remember one that was a moment. It said, "Now for a moment of science." It said, and you could hear that silence was the word that was not spoken there. And I think here too, this is a poem that does not contain the word science, but has that replacement, silence, In poetry, silence is often a good thing. It's something we go to poetry for, not continuous noise, but moments between words, between stanzas and ideas. So it's interesting to see it negatively valued. The other thing I would say about this poem is that it's not real, but surreal. And I think it's something more and more people are thinking about. How many times have you heard people say of recent events, it's surreal or it's unreal? And I just heard it today on the radio, and apropos of Comey. And it seems that surreal today means an like an unassimilated reality, something that is still abnormal that we can't really process. I mean, the very idea that you would have a march for science, or you would say, I'm in favor of facts, it sounds like a surreal or an absurdist statement. You see? So I think there is something that lends itself, a surrealism that lends itself to political poetry, and also, in this case, allegory, where you have rivers and also facts being personified and allowed to speak. And I do think, in some ways, allegory was the first surrealism. You have deaf and whatnot talking in every man. So I'll turn to my poem, another occasional poem. I wrote this the day after the election and read it with other poets at Point Reyes station in a church. And it is published in an occasional anthology. Let's see, resist much, obey little. That's apparently a Whitman phrase. Inaugural poems to the resistance. So that's why I brought this one along from this large anthology. This mine is called The Weather Between the States. The sun, the evening after the election, plummeted into the Pacific, sinking the sharp-shadowed coast and also the Atlantic seaboard into an ice-blue darkness. Meanwhile, the southern and the middle states heard snowmelt trickling through snow and dug themselves out of their media dens into an unbelievably roseate spring. The coastal and the urban eyes could not adjust to the unforeseen and unforecast cold snap. They muted their audio, wiped moist breaths from their windshields, and craned their necks for a turnoff. Like those on the oceans, those in the river-drained interior couldn't believe their eyes. They pinched themselves or said, "Pinch me," to each other, when really they just wanted to dream. On call or commuting from service counter to counter, they scanned the skies for early signs of jobs migrating back north. But they saw only winter on the wing. Still, they'd keep watch till bedtime. Both the dull blue and the red-flushed grown-ups read to their children, who noticed their voices were edged with chill or with gleam, suffered their shivering or their hearty hugs, and burrowed more deeply into their woolen stories. Or if they asked what was wrong, were told that the season had flipped, but that they would be fine. Either way, readers on edge checked their windows and blinds and their watches for their adolescents, who braved the weather in anthem-drenched blocks, in coats storm-resistant or repellent, or who smoked in Indian summer light by country convenience markets and made plans for evacuating to the city. Thank you.
Right, so next we will have Brittany Perham.
Go to the podium.
Either is fine. Okay.
Point it down. Is that right? Is it
Straight to you.
up this way? Is that good? Okay. Thanks, Becca, and thanks to all of you for coming to the library, for having me. I'm going to just start by reading this poem. This is Anne Bradstreet, the author to her book, and this is maybe a poem that we're familiar with, but it's a poem that's been sort of a lot in my imagination recently, so I thought I would talk some about this. The author to her book. Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, who after birth didst by my side remain, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, who thee abroad, exposed to public view, made thee in rags, halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. At thy return my blushing was not small, my rambling brat in print should mother call, I cast thee by as one unfit for light, the visage was so irksome in my sight. Yet being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot, still made a flaw. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou run'st more hobbling than is meet. In better dress to trim thee was my mind, but not save homespun cloth in the house I find. In this array mongst vulgars mayst thou roam, in critics' hands beware thou dost not come, and take thy way where yet thou art not known. If for thy father asked, say thou hadst none, and for thy mother, she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. So we may probably have some context with this poem, I'm not sure. So just if we haven't encountered this poem in a while, this was included in Anne Bradstreet's collection in 1650, the 10th Muse. And she was is considered to be one of our first American poets, or a poet that sort of bridges old world and new world. And she's a Puritan woman living in the Mass Bay Colony, living in New England, and puts out this book of poems. And I love the story of this because it's such a great sort of collaboration between her and her family to make this ruse that she didn't know anything about her poems being taken from her and being published. Her brother-in-law took the poems with him to England, and they were published. But of course, she knew that her poems were going to be published, even though she sort of disavows that in this moment. And there's much evidence for that, including a poem that was later brought to John in England to be included with the book at the last minute, which of course she would have had to know and send to him. So, but she has to make this move to sort of disavow the book and remain a woman and a Puritan woman, but clearly the poem also claims the book and the poems in really interesting ways. I love that line so much. If for thy father asked, say thou hadst none, right? This is her book, right? There is no father here. There's no man here in the book. And I also like, and I think that this is another reason why I chose this poem for us today, is I also like that this poem starts to embrace a new language and starts to be interested in talking about a new way of speaking, a new way of writing poems. And we see that right with the but not save homespun cloth in the house I find, right? So this idea that the language is going to become new, is going to be different than the language of poetry that came before. And so I bring this poem in a couple of lights. The first is that, I mean, we're however many hundred years later, and there are still questions about women and women's ambition, and how that ambition
in writing is manifested or not, and how the community and the publishing world thinks about that. But I more bring it, aside from that and aside from exactly what it's about, I more bring it to us because this poem gives me an experience. Something in me changes when I read it and when I think of that line, if for thy father asked, say thou hadst none. And I was thinking about, you may be familiar with Adrienne Rich's idea that the moment when a feeling enters the body is political, right? And that poems have the power to do that, to sort of like embody a feeling, so that we're not being told about something, but rather we are getting that experience sort of entered directly into our body through the poem. And it's a means of connection, right? Like I read this poem and think about this poem, and her mind, right, and what appears on the page bridges that distance between us in some way. And I think that's how political action in a certain way works in poems, not by telling us what to think or what to do, although there are certainly protest poems that are grounded in particular issues that do really interesting work, but they allow us to enter an experience in a bodily and spiritual way that will connect us with each other. And it allows then the reader to take that sort of energy, and that transforms something in them, that maybe they make something in the world or connect to someone else in another way. So that's why I was thinking about this poem. I've just been thinking a lot about that line lately, and just a lot about her and her work. So she has many great poems. If you haven't read much of Anne Bradstreet in a while, maybe check that out. And I'll read you, let's see. I'm going to read you a poem that does sort of address this question of gender, but in a bit of a different way. This is from a forthcoming book, and I'm locating it at this moment because I haven't read very much from this. And this poem came because I was at a dinner with a famous male fiction writer and his wife. And at one point, his wife referred to herself in a couple of points, in not a joking way, as Mrs. his first name. And I just thought it was so interesting to listen to that and to think about what that was. So this is where that poem comes from. You be writer, I'll be wife. Call me wifelet, wolflet. Do you love me in a hairnet? The only she smurfette, pirouette, safety net. Is it time for children yet? Bread maker, bed maker, southern drawl doll, baker, name taker, prize dinner date. I've never once been late. Darling, darlette, baby, aren't you wet yet? Typist, typecast, Mrs. You. How would a blow-up woman do? You're the writer. Here's your wife. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Brittany. Next, we have Katie Peterson.
I'm going to sit right here. I live right around the block on Cornell Avenue, and it took me 4.5 minutes to get here. It's the quickest it's ever taken me to get to a poetry event. So I didn't have to leave my usual hour and a half.
Now you have no excuse for not coming to all of these events.
Ouch. So I brought in a poem called Golden Wasp by the Swedish poet Thomas Tranströmer, in a translation by Robin Fulton. And there's one thing I want to tell you about in it before I read it. At the end of the poem, the poet refers to Persephone. Persephone's mother was Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, and her father was Zeus. He was the father of a lot of people. And the famous story about Persephone was that she was so beautiful that Hades, the god of the underworld, kidnapped her. And this began the creation of the seasons, that Demeter mourned for Persephone, and Hades finally allowed her to come back up, but only after she had to spend 6 months in the underworld, 1 month for each pomegranate seed she ate while she was there. Golden wasp. The blind worm, that legless lizard, flows along the porch step, calm and majestic as an anaconda, only the size is different. The sky is covered with clouds, but the sun pushes through. Such is the day. This morning, the woman I love drove away the evil spirits. As when you open the door of a dark shed somewhere in the south and the light pours in, and the cockroaches scurry into the corners and up the walls and are gone. You saw them and you didn't see them. So her nakedness made the demons run, as if they never existed. But they'll come back, with 1,000 hands crossing the lines in the old-fashioned telephone exchange of the nerves. It's the 5th of July. The lupins are stretching up as if they wanted to catch sight of the sea. We're in the church of keeping silence, of piety according to no letter. As if they didn't exist, the implacable faces of the patriarchs and the misspelling of God's name in stone. I saw a true-to-the-letter TV preacher who'd piled up money, but he was weak now and needed the support of a bodyguard who was a well-tailored young man with a smile tight as a muzzle, a smile stifling a scream, the scream of a child left alone in a hospital bed when the parents leave. The divine brushes against a human being and lights a flame, but then draws back. Why? The flame attracts the shadows. They fly rustling in and join the flame, which rises and blackens, and the smoke spreads out black and strangling. At last, only the black smoke. At last, only the pious executioner. The pious executioner leans forward over the market square and the crowd that make a grainy mirror in which he can see himself. The greatest fanatic is the greatest doubter. Without knowing it, he is a pact between two where the one is 100% visible and the other invisible. How I hate the expression 100%. Those who can never exist anywhere except on their facades, those who are never absent-minded, those who never open the wrong door and catch a glimpse of the unidentified one. Walk past them. It's the 5th of July. The sky is covered with clouds, but the sun pushes through. The blind worm flows along the porch step, calm and majestic as an anaconda. The blind worm as if there were no bureaucracy, the golden wasp as if there were no idolatry, the lupins as if there were no 100%. I know the depth where one is both prisoner and ruler like Persephone. I often lay in the stiff grass down there and watched the earth arch over me, the vault of the earth. Often, that was half my life. But today, my gaze has left me. My blindness has gone away. The dark bat has left my face and is scissoring around in summer's bright space. Lately, I feel like I've defaulted to Aristotle's old notion of what politics is, and he said that it was simply the problem of living together. It helps to think about that earthy problem in earthy terms. I live with Christians, I live with racists, I live with children, I live with the state of Louisiana, I live with the state of Ohio, I live with Washington State, with Seattle, with Vermont. In this country, this enactment of living together, the enactment of politics itself, is problematic because of our differences. and how far away we are. But Jesus knew that too, who taught that I live with my brother is the greatest political problem of all. It is true that we live together with other people even when we're alone. The aloneness of Transtromer's meditative poem about losing track of time on a summer day, oh, losing track of time, the most precious thing, is full of people. The aloneness is full of people. In their ordinary but erotic morning, the married couple have to drive a whole posse of demons away. In the Church of Keeping Silence, I think it's a non-denominational church, the patriarchs appear. In the mind-free associating, a TV preacher and his thuggish bodyguard appear. In an imagination of a possible God, a pious executioner appears in order to banish them to see another world. Transtromer has to live with the insects, blindworm, golden wasp, this kind of new community. Does the bodyguard remind you of anyone? Transtromer cares that he's scared. Since the election, I've been thinking a lot about the interior. We used to call it the soul. I feel pushed even deeper into it, but what a poem like this reveals to me is that inside us is the world. You can't run from it. You don't get inside and outside. The demons find you. But they look different, cleared away from their social roles. They look more like us. Transtromer has the most empathy and the most fear for the bodyguard of the TV evangelist, whose smile is like a scream, the scream of a child left alone in a hospital bed when the parents leave. It reminds me of Congress. The terror on the faces of those who terrify is what he sees. Transtromer, a Swede, won the Nobel Prize in 2011. He trained as a psychologist, and he wrote many of his poems about children and young people during the 1970s. This time deep in the Cold War, living in the Baltic region, where he had several friends who were either imprisoned or censored by fascist governments. In his day, he was often accused of not being political, and I think you can see why. This is a poem about losing track of time on a summer day. But I read his poems when public language feels bankrupt to me, and I think that's why he wrote them, to find the language of the unsaid, to find in the silence not a political space, but one that hasn't yet been politicized. And that by finding that, a real political space might be possible. The train of thought that moves the poem along is associative, not rational. It's not about asserting a set of values. It's about stepping past what culture values for a few minutes. This is a poem about wasting time. How I hate the expression 100%. Swedes love the summer. My father's Swedish, so I know this. He does the summer better than anyone. He's the thirstiest man in the desert. The happiness of the summer in Transtromer's eyes coexists with darkness. They have to live together in a space. And at the end of the poem, he welcomes both happiness and darkness in. I just wanted to read one of my own poems. And I wrote it for my husband, who is an immigrant to this country from South Korea. And I'd been wanting to write him a love poem for some time, but it's like I married the guy. The burden of writing a love poem for the person you married is like huge. I'd never written him one also. But he's been back and forth about wanting to be a citizen in the last 3 or 4 years, and this poem is partially on the occasion of that. And the title of the poem is the name of a writer who is famous for spending a lot of time in North Africa. He wrote a book called The Sheltering Sky. Paul Bowles. He wanted them to give him money. He asked for a massive tape machine to collect the music of Morocco. The book got made into a movie. When I watched it, I saw a breast, the first in my life that didn't belong to my family. In the Central Valley, my husband teaches his students. Husband, a word from the Normans, younger than the word wife. This morning, we had to borrow money. It made me want to say to him, "Did you know the things you'd have to do if you came to my country? What kind of traveler are you? Oppositional. I want what I didn't have before. Today I want my husband to come home in the middle of the day and sit here at the kitchen table and act like nothing bad could be for very long. Tea in the Sahara, a china cup with a spray of pink rosebud importing a strange and unacknowledged humidity into the windswept scene. Sand sediments in the saucer. They wanted to do that in the novel. In times like these, no one asks for sugar. Thank you.
Right, next up we have Amos White.
Good evening. I'm going to spoil the magic. Oh, I hate doing this. So, politics, eh? This couldn't have been it's like a softball. I've been in politics, literally in politics, which she probably didn't know, Rebecca. But it's a nice softball. I've been doing campaign politics for 32 years, since I was a senior in high school, either running campaigns or volunteering on campaigns, and now even in marketing campaigns. But yeah, so this one's kind of close to home, especially with all the content we have being generated for us with 45 et al. So, spoiler alert. Normally I just do a haiku. This could have been a really quick talk. I do one haiku of somebody I like and another haiku, and I'd say thank you. You're not going to get that tonight. Yeah. Okay. Well. So. In preface, I would just say I've literally been looking for the intersection and renaissance of the citizen. You spoke of Aristotle, not Plato. Who I worshipped as a kid. We had all my dad's books. I still have them. That he's passed. And I would lay there on the heat register in Ohio also in the wintertime or spring on a Saturday with a blanket over top of me with a big mushroom of hot air and be in those books, whether they were the Reader's Digest and all those stories or his college books. And it was the Republic that really grabbed me in a lot of those stories. And I'm sure now that's probably between that and my mother's Black's Law Dictionary. If you're in the legal field, that's like your Bible. It really laid a framework for me. And I've really been looking for being both a creative person and, oddly enough, an analytical person, the intersection of the two, because I know I'm the living embodiment of that. I do both. And for a lot of people, they can't believe either I don't do drugs and this is really who I am. But it's true. It's true. But to see what's going to wake that within many of the rest of us. Because I really do believe that we as people and we as poets do dream the future here for others. And it's the intersection of that poetry with that citizen spirit, again, that I've been both following and or supporting and or trying to manifest in the wake of the past 15 months of the de-evolution of what all has transpired. So tonight, I'd like to read some poetry of a local poet some of you might have heard before. His name is Tango Eisen Martin. If brilliance ever was corporal, it would be Tango. That's it. Spoken word genius, but all poetry, which is an art. And literally, poetry, almost writing poetry or reading poetry is a political act. And as Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. And to me, it doesn't get any more political, especially now, than what is local and happening local, and starting with the self in our own communities. And Tango is all about that in his poetry. I'm going to share this with you. It's called Blood in My Eye. Guided by teeth goes the country. There's a cow's mouth on the flag. A peculiar notepad holds street life dear, but the writer's not here. He's somewhere off talking to tombstones about the good old days. Or splashing reborn water on his latest face, or wondering how his old gun's doing in the afterlife, wondering how much death trap in those gas station aisles. Got to be $1 million a day on this concrete island. New engine, and the moon wide never goes down. 72 hours a night, at least according to everyone's posture around here. 8:30 in the morning, really 30 minutes to closing. The city shuts down for a sleepy rats race. Elevator shoe shuffle to the nearest heaven, laughing with rats the whole way up there. It scares everywhere. In puddles of city. In concentrated schools. The TV lit warm rooms, the light reveals military figures or military fatigues when it hits just right on their ties, that wrapped around their necks of lazy white guys. Empire's too easy. Chin at the walls of Summit, if you feel like it. Best way for a target, best way to hit a target, is to move. Let me get that again. Best way for a target to move is to shooting back, running for a tree line made of freeways. Wisdom says against the war machine on Tuesday you stand no chance. But may we be the last poor men to you, play it safe, cow's mouth on the flag. A politician raises his hand and the crowd shows their teeth. An oligarch raises his hand. Little girls are not safe outside. You are all high, depressed, and comrades in function. 15 minutes to closing. And the city survives another rebellion. Stay down. We just paying dues by transfers, not just anybody can say it. Don't you love how deadly things whisper in the moment, and men kill like feathers fall, and everybody screaming inside? The writer knows the death is not a matter of dignity, rather humor. And a house that smells like roaches, like roach races, nuclear percentages on torn stoves. I'm in here like never was. Just lazy matches and manic inhumanity, hands rushing away from life towards stuff. What are we doing here? Surviving. For no reason in particular. Because nobody's going far today. Nobody going far tomorrow. Trust me, hell and heaven cannot count. Strange gardens with secondhand clothes play, and concrete wishes to be human so that it can be a cannibal where they find you drenched. And drains wish they could be human so that they could be worthy arms for you could die in. Greet them all, grandson. Prepare for the day when every child is calm, and don't say we ghosts didn't write you a poem. Don't say we didn't dig your life. Remember the shotgun by the coat rack that everybody in the house knows how to use. Remember the tightrope made of needles for walking in between driveways and man-made best friends. Go ahead, grandson. Tune this street again. Never mind this country kills musicians first. Broken neck nights, scared neck life. If these walls could write lyrics, they'd say, what's your angle, angel eyes? 30 to 50 rounds pass by. On a street with no daughters. This street has no sons. This young prisoners of war in a racist city that means to make capital. That we know so much. We know it all. We were stood against walls. Who's on the third cross around here? Cow's mouth, salivating over the street. And that is the story of why we aim at teeth. It is customary not to clap for the poet. Thank you very much. I gotta read this. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy wrote this on Poetry and Power. Some of you might remember it. When power leads man towards arrogance, poetry reminds him of his limitations. When power narrows the area of man's concern, poetry reminds him of the richness and diversity of existence. When power corrupts, poetry cleanses. That's been my meditation lately. I hope yours has been a lot more docile. But I do want to thank you for pulling this together, because it has been something weighing heavily on my mind. There was I don't know if many of you follow some of the zines online, The Right Stuff, put out by Evan Karp over in San Francisco, the ingenue producer and poet himself and musician. And something snapped back in October, shortly before the election. Actually, it was August. And this literally has been a meditation. It's not a preoccupation, but our language as poets has been changing, and we have been reflecting what's been going on, and it's been very local. And I do believe we need more instances like this to bring to the public, so that we do hit that nerve within that many of you may need to feel sustained, to feel supported, to create new and to create anew. I'm going to close with one of my own. And it may sound similar, and I only realized this at 2 o'clock in the morning, right before I emailed you, to tangos. But ironically enough, coincidentally enough, it's one of the first non-haiku I wrote. It's called The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. Oh, you do have it. Oh, you guys are good. I'm sorry, it's called The Revolution Will Now Be Live Streamed. The revolution will not be televised. No, it will be streamed and tweeted and Snapchatted and IG'd and hashtagged and regrammed and shared and shared and shared and shared and shared and shared and posted on the milkman's other wall in high school halls of science and Congress. The ones where her words persist like an echo. We recite on the open mic drop. The revolution will now be live streamed. We won't stop, because this beat goes on and on and on and on. Won't stop because we had a likeness occupy whiteness in the masses' house 8 dry years. And the mother of all tears dropped. And the mother of all tears dropped. And the mother of all tears dropped like the business end of the NRA. Won't play CNN nor ABC, CBS, MSNBC by the dawn's early light. Do I pray that your words, that your wounds, that your children never reach the end of their rainbow. You know the one where you mark start at the end of every commercial like we two were Becky. But I am he, and you are me, and he is they, and we are all together. Who could shrug the 99% of our net worth, unfaded t-shirt at the end of each day? Never mind. Nor would I ever try to give back to a community long robbed of its fathers, of its lawyers, of its ancestral wealth, for whiteness propped up, bite, bake, and bust in every morning, noon, and night. Where's gone the dream? A dream. We murmur, we defer. Only as long as the beat goes marching, marching to the break beat. Stream, the revolution will now be stream, tag 'em, retribution, revolution. Click, bit, send. Thank you. You're not on.
So I just wanted to take this moment to thank these poets. This was an experiment, a scientific poetic experiment, and I think it was pretty darn successful. And I think we should do this again, guys. So thank you so much. Yeah. Putting these folks together, I had no idea what each of them would say. I just knew that I respected all of their intellects. Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk about Gwendolyn Brooks for a bit. And the poem that you see there, Bronzeville mother loiters in Mississippi. Meanwhile, a Mississippi mother burns bacon. So this year is the centennial celebration of Gwendolyn Brooks. She was born in 1917 in Topeka, Kansas, but she's truly a daughter of mid-century African-American Chicago. By 1950, she had won a Pulitzer Prize for her book, Annie Allen, which depicts the life of a Black girl growing into adulthood in Chicago. A critic, George Kent, states on the Poetry Foundation website that Brooks holds a unique position in American letters. She's managed to bridge the gap between the largely white, my words, academic poets of her generation in the 1940s and the young Black militant writers of the 60s. In the poem that we're looking at today, A Bronzeville Mother, you can see Brooks working within her familiar forms of ballad and narrative, but the speaker of the poem is entirely surprising. And I'll speak for a couple more paragraphs about the poem before I read it, because I think it needs some serious contextualizing. So her monologue here gives voice to Carolyn Bryant, who you'll remember is the accuser of Emmett Till. She sets the poem in the Bryant household during the time of the trial. Through this dramatic monologue, with its sometimes hard to comprehend stream of ramblings, Brooks, I believe, is able to get to the bottom of Till's murder by giving us the voice of his very accuser. Here we have poetry in the service of truth-telling, poetry that gives us the real news. It lets us in on the secret unspoken beliefs and compromises hidden within the fabric of the traditional Southern white patriarchy that had to murder Till and had to let his killers go free. A scholar, Molly McKibben, says, by focusing on the white woman rather than a figure of obvious power or hate, or a figure of obvious sympathy and victimization, Brooks is able to examine the insidious and infectious nature of hierarchical power and romantic desire. So how uncanny, how interesting for Brooks to choose this interior voice to give us. Everything is mixed up, as you'll see in the poem, in the mind of Carolyn Bryant. She believes in the beginning of the poem in the myth of chivalry. She doesn't understand the connections between her ladyhood and lynching. Her confusion is not excused in the poem, and even with the change in her consciousness in the middle of the poem, she remains entirely complicit. Bryant, McKibben states, made a decision to support her husband and to secure her own comfort, rather than using the opportunity to expose Black suffering to a wide audience. Brooks seems to be telling us that the mythology of the Southern white lady has to be dismantled by Southern white ladies themselves if change is going to occur. The poem speaks to me. I've been writing about skin privilege before I knew there was a word for it. This difference at the bottom of everything in the environment of my Southern childhood. I was never told that blacks and whites were the same, that I should be blind to color. This notion would have been laughable, even to a child in a town equally divided between black and white, where the black half of the population lived below the federal poverty line in the 1980s. So now I have the problem of raising white boys, which Brooks almost addresses in this poem. My white sons will benefit from enormous social, financial, and racial privilege for their lives, no matter how I raise them. They might leverage that privilege to play a part in dismantling race privilege. But right now, because they're little, raising them means reading children's books about kindness and the imagination, or even about Congressman John Lewis's childhood in Alabama. Even in preschool, my white boys play the game of Jim Crow, although they don't call it that, of the oppressor and the oppressed. "You're black, sit in the back of the car," one son says to the other as we pile into the minivan. Or my child says, "Some people were hurting a girl like she was black and I told them to stop." It's painful, the loss of their innocence at so young an age, but as Brooks reminds us, black children in our country have never had the benefit of that innocence. All right, so now I'll read this poem. It's long, it's rambling, it's hard to understand, it's disturbing, and entirely fascinating. She wrote this in 1960. From the first, it had been like a ballad. It had the beat inevitable. It had the blood. A wildness cut up and tied in little bunches. Like the 4-line stanzas of the ballads she had never quite understood. The ballads they had set her to in school. Herself, the milk-white maid, the maid mild of the ballad, pursued by the dark villain, rescued by the fine prince, the happiness ever after, that was worth anything. It was good to be a maid mild. That made the breath go fast. Her bacon burned. She hastened to hide it in the step-on can and drew more strips from the meat case. The eggs and sour milk biscuits did well. She set out a jar of her new quince preserve. But there was something about the matter of the dark villain. He should have been older, perhaps. The hacking down of a villain was more fun to think about. When his menace possessed undisputed breadth, undisputed height, and best of all, when history was cluttered with the bones of many eaten knights and princesses. The fun was disturbed, then all but nullified, when the dark villain was a blackish child of 14, with eyes still too young to be dirty, and a mouth too young to have lost every reminder of its infant softness. That boy must have been surprised, for these were grown-ups. Grown-ups were supposed to be wise, and the fine prince and that other, so tall, so broad, so grown. Perhaps the boy had never guessed that the trouble with grown-ups was that under the magnificent shell of adulthood, just under, waited the baby full of tantrums. It occurred to her that there may have been something ridiculous to the picture of the fine prince, rushing, rich with the breadth and height and mature solidness whose lack in the dark villain was impressing her, confronting her more and more as this first day after the trial and acquittal wore on, rushing with its heavy companion to hack down, unhorsed, that little foe. So much had happened she could not remember now what that foe had done against her, or if anything had been done. The breaks were everywhere, that she could think of no thread capable of the necessary sew work. She made the baby sit in their places at the table. Then before calling him, she hurried to the mirror with her comb and lipstick. It was necessary to be more beautiful than ever, the beautiful wife. For sometimes she fancied he looked at her as though measuring her, as if he considered, had she been worth it? Had she been worth the blood, the cramped cries, the little stirring bravado, the gradual dulling of those Negro eyes, the sudden, overwhelming little boyness in that barn? Whatever she might feel or half feel, the lipstick necessity was something apart. He must never conclude that she had not been worth it. He sat down the fine prince and began buttering a biscuit. He looked at his hands. More papers were in from the north, he mumbled. More maddening headlines, with their pepper words, bestiality and barbarism, and shocking. The half sneers he had mastered for the trial worked across his sweet and pretty face. What he'd like to do, he explained, was kill them all. The time lost, the unwanted fame. Still, it had been fun to show those intruders a thing or two, to show that snappy-eyed mother, that sassy, northern, brown-black. Nothing could stop Mississippi. He knew that. Big fella knew that. And what was so good, Mississippi knew that. They could send in their petitions and scar their newspapers with bleeding headlines. Their governors could appeal to Washington. What I want, the older baby said, is lasses on my jam. Whereupon the younger baby picked up the molasses pitcher and threw the molasses in his brother's face. Instantly, the fine prince leaned across the table and slapped the small and smiling criminal. She did not speak. When the hand came down and away, and she could look at her child, at her baby child, she could think only of blood. Surely her baby's cheek had disappeared, and in its place surely hung a heaviness, a lengthening red, a red that had no end. She shook her head. It was not true, of course. It was not true at all. The child's face was, as always, the color of the paste in her paste jar. She left the table to the tune of the children's lamentations, which were shriller than ever. She looked out of a window. She said not a word. That was one of the new somethings. The fear, tying her as with iron. Suddenly she felt his hands upon her. He had followed her to the window. The children were whimpering now. Such bits of tots. And she, their mother, could not protect them. She looked at her shoulders, still gripped in the claim of his hands. She tried, but could not resist the idea that a red ooze was seeping, spreading darkly, thickly, slowly over her white shoulders, her own shoulders, and over all of Earth and Mars. He whispered something to her, did the fine prince, something about love and night and intention. She heard no hoofbeat of the horse and saw no flash of shining steel. He pulled her face around to meet his, and there it was, close, for the first time in all the days and nights, his mouth, wet and red, so very, very red, closed over hers. Then a sickness heaved within her, the courtroom Coca-Cola, the courtroom beer and hate and sweat and drone, pushed like a wall against her. She wanted to bear it, but his mouth would not go away, and neither would the decapitated exclamation points in that other woman's eyes. She did not scream. She stood there, but a hatred for him burst into glorious flower, and its perfume enclasped them, bigger than all magnolias. The last bleak news of the ballad, the rest of the rugged music, the last quatrain. So this is a separate poem, but it's a companion poem, the last quatrain of the Ballad of Emmett Till. And it's obviously in the voice of Mamie Till. After the murder, after the burial. Emmett's mother is a pretty-faced thing, the tint of pulled taffy. She sits in a red room, drinking black coffee. She kisses her killed boy, and she is sorry. Chaos and windy grays through a red prairie. So, how extraordinary that Brooks is choosing to inhabit the mind of Carolyn Bryant, and how she gets to the bottom of the myth of chivalry, and how that goes hand in hand with violence. So here's number one. I have number two. I don't have number three yet. Common problems in the raising of white boys. I've got a plantation under my skirt, from red clay spun to white suns. The whole 18th century, master's whip or mercy, eternal Julys of 1962, 2015. Gavel pound and seersucker in their skin. They look the same as the deputy in the photo kicking another man to the ground. I turn from history's screen to my boys' freckled noses, fair hair reddening. It does no good to scream. All right, so we'll close there. Thanks for coming. We'll take a short break and then have open mic.